are you? So I really didn't want to do this. I wanted to do all of our civil rights content together in class because it's so incredibly important. But we are running out of time. We have 16 days. So if you go to your civil rights outline to section 3, I'm going to talk us through voting rights and how that's the second piece of the movement, right? Because you and I will talk about in class how segregation is obviously tackled and ends with the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And then now this is the voting piece. And this ultimately is going to be dealt with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Good job. I know you got it. Okay, so if we look at voting rights, essentially desegregation is won, even though that battle never really ends. With the Civil Rights Act in 1964, now reform is needed in voting. And if we look at why, you have 5 million black people living in the South at the time, and 1.4 million of that 5, only 1.4 million of that 5 are registered to vote. And of course, that's just not acceptable. That's not enough. And we know the grandfather clause is a literacy test, all those things, just terror from the KKK being used to stop people from voting who have, any kind of African American ethnicity. And it's profoundly unokay. So Bobby Kennedy is going to meet with SNCC members, and they focus this on, getting those people registered to vote and taking it from there. So they come up with something called VEP, which stands for Voter Education Project in 1962. And that is going to be going into the Deep South with these volunteers to get people registered to vote. It is not without conflict. All these people, you can imagine they are students, they are teachers, they are people who have summers off, they are people who feel strongly, they are people who can economically afford to go down there and do this. Some of them are killed, some of them are jailed, lots of them are beaten. But this is going to be a huge success, and overall, when VEP takes place in 62, 500,000 more African Americans are going to be registered to vote, so that gets that number up to around 2 million. Not great, but it's better. VEP is a success in every single state except for Mississippi. The state of Mississippi is going to be, as we said, the worst, the most racist, most white supremacist state at the time. And they are going to fight this, and it is terrible. So we'll talk more about that, because then they're going to tackle Mississippi with something called Freedom Summer. But quickly, the 24th Amendment in 1962 is going to ban poll tax. We know that poll tax has been used to pay to vote in a democratic country. Should never happen, but it's been there. It's been in the Jim Crow South. And obviously people who were sharecroppers, tenant farmers, etc., who are black can't pay this, so they weren't voting. Now that's done. So that's going to be LBJ pushing that through, the 24th Amendment in 1962, getting rid of poll tax. So let's talk about Freedom Summer. Freedom Summer is going to be put together by Robert Moses of SNCC. He's an organizer, and they asked for all these volunteers who are willing to spend their summer going down to Mississippi to register African Americans to vote. And this happens in 1964. Mostly, even though all different people respond, mostly white, middle upper class, northern college students respond. They are the ones who have the time, they are the ones who feel strongly about this, and what they did was they went to Ohio first to receive training. And this training was, yes, about how to conduct yourself. This training was very often to how to stay safe, how to stay alive, how to get in the fetal position, and how to cover your head, and how to not fight back and still be alive, which is really incredible. There's some videos and pictures that I'll show you guys for people who are learning this, and unbelievable that our country is going through this. So the two goals of Freedom Summer are going to be education and voting registration. And it is insane at this time in the South. Mississippi still shut down black schools, elementary, middle, and high schools, so that black children would pick cotton. That's what we're dealing with here. So if we look at why is something like this necessary, it's just so overwhelmingly necessary. Then in the 1960s, if you were black, you would not go to school, and you would instead be told you have to pick cotton. And then we wonder what is even different after the Civil War, right? So Robert Moses says it's great, education and voting registration. I hope everyone stays alive. And sadly, that is not going to happen. So the first 200 volunteers are going to be sent down June 20th of 1964. And 3 volunteers are going to go out in the morning. They knew to not go anywhere at night. They go out in the morning to check out a church that was burned down by the KKK. Their names were Andrew Goodman, James Chaney, and Michael Schwerner. And they go missing. And when they go missing, there is a huge frenzied FBI investigation for them. And yes, it is a big deal because 2 of those kids are white. That is just the honest truth at this time. If it was 3 black people, we would not really hear about this because it's 2 white young men along with the black man. This becomes enormous, enormous news. What happened was the KKK knew that they were there, and they went all together, the 3 of them, right, in the morning because they knew it was unsafe. The KKK knew that they were leaving, and they waited for them. And a police member who was affiliated with the KKK stopped them and said they were speeding when they were not. And then he brought them to jail and brought them to jail all day for a speeding ticket. Now, if someone ever says to you, you're speeding, you're going to jail, that shouldn't happen. They should have gotten a ticket and been on their way. It was all a ruse to get them in the jail. Kept them there all day. And meanwhile, the KKK hotline was still buzzing. And they created this whole plan. They released the boys at night, and the KKK was waiting for them. They chased them down. They shot all 3 young men, put their bodies in a dam, and then shoved the car into a pond. Now, this is found out later, and again, the police officer who was a part of this, who's a member of the KKK, goes on the national news with tears in his eyes, and he says,
I don't know where those young boys are. Ain't it a shame we can't find them? I just feel terrible.
He is lying on national television. This is who we're dealing with, right? And when they do get arrested, the people that are involved, the state drops all charges. The state of Mississippi said we have nothing to charge them for. It goes to the federal courts, and again, murderers were given 4 years. They killed them, and they were given 4 years' time. This case was just reopened in 2005, and we talked about this in class. So many of these cases, because of the time, justice was never served. They're being reopened in 2005, 2017, all of this. And these people even went and gave an interview afterwards, boasting to a magazine how they killed him, and they still were not given any time. That has changed, but just still. So after this, as you can imagine, most volunteers are going to go home. Those who stay endure going to jail, getting beat, getting shot, bombings, and 17,000 black people are going to be registered to vote in Mississippi after Freedom Summer. And this is a really big deal. And the state of Mississippi, are you ready, accepts of those 17,000, 1,600 people. So clearly we need something more. We need something bigger here. And we see that people are just becoming, as Fannie Lou Hamer says, sick and tired of being sick and tired. This is going to be a really famous quote. There is a woman who gives an emotional speech of the MFDP, and that stands for Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. Obviously, the state of Mississippi, you're not voting if you're black. So are those your congressmen and your legislatures? No. So they showed up at the Democratic National Convention, this Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, a group of black politicians and activists and people and volunteers, and they demanded to be sat with the Democratic National Convention. And LBJ doesn't know what to do because they haven't been, elected, but at the same time, they haven't voted for the people who are. So he has this compromise, and he says, okay, 2 of you can sit down, and the rest of the people at the convention have to be guests. And here we see the beginning fractures of the civil rights movement. You have a side with Martin Luther King and the SCLC that is going to say, stay nonviolent protest, take the compromise, this is what we'll do. And then you see this other side. You see SNCC, the students, and the MFDP become more radical and say, no, this is not enough. And we see these 2 sides start to take shape. And one is going to be more willing to work with the current challenges, and that's Martin Luther King. And the other is going to be just so tired that there is this slow protest, slow progress, and they want that radical action to happen right now, right? They want it to happen now. And even Martin Luther King later in his life becomes more like that, which is interesting. And then to really publicize what's going on with the right to vote in 1965, you have the Selma campaign. So Selma is going to be in Alabama, and I don't know if anybody saw the movie. Selma just came out. Ava DuVernay, I don't want to say it incorrectly, kind of made history as a black female director and producer to put it on. Oprah was behind it as well. This just came out, and this highlights what happens in Selma, and it is a very big deal. So Martin Luther King goes to Selma because they're going to have this march from Selma to the Capitol. And he is going to be arrested, and it attracts national media, right? So Governor George Wallace, who we remember from before saying segregation now, segregation forever, at the same spot that Jefferson Davis was inaugurated as president of the Confederacy, some pretty hefty symbolism there. He's going to say, no, you can't march. Now, you and I could march to Batavia if we wanted to. It's legal. It's peaceful. It's a march. That's it. We're just walking. That's all. You can't stop people from walking. He says, no, it's illegal. And Martin Luther King, again, keep in mind, is in jail, right? So people saying, no, we're going to do it. We're going to continue even if MLK's in jail. And they plan it. And on March 7th, 1965, 600 black people have just left church. They're all dressed up. Men in suits, women in their, hats and their purses and their beautiful stockings and their shoes and everything. So they start peacefully making their way across the bridge. And again, they are coming from church, and the police start to block their way. And then what essentially happens is the police just rush them with electric cattle prods, with whips, with tear gas, and they start beating these people, these innocent people who are coming from church, into the ground. And again, the difference is now in 1965, it is all captured on television. And this is going to be known as Bloody Sunday in Selma. And they are going to cross this Edmund Pettus Bridge, and they do not cross it, and this bridge is still going to be so symbolic and such a, symbol of horror and also of hope, and that these people are, again, looking at this. A nation is watching, horrified, and they will never forget the events of that day. And again, it's known as Bloody Sunday. And the federal government needs to respond, right? So a few days later, Martin Luther King is going to lead a march after he's released out of jail, and they receive federal protection. And LBJ is now, days after Bloody Sunday, going to push forward the Voting Rights Act in 1965. And he is just going to say it is so wrong, it is dead wrong, that you have these people this happened to, people that aren't voting, who are a part of our country, who are citizens. It doesn't make any sense, right? And he's going to say this, and this is going to be the most comprehensive Voting Rights Act we've ever seen passed in our nation's history. It breaks down all of these barriers, especially in those deep South states. And okay, voting, right? You're going to be able to do it next year. Stop and think about it. Without a vote, no one cares about your issues. Without a vote, you do not have a voice. Without a vote, you cannot get the KKK affiliated politicians out of office. And without getting them out of office, those Jim Crow laws are never going to leave. Without getting them out of office, your kids are never going to go to a good school. And you need to have that change. You need to, if you want a fighting chance in life. And this is going to be so huge. And then over time, slowly, you're going to see African Americans permeate local, state, and federal positions in the government. And then, because they are the ones making decisions, they're going to make decisions that don't include brutality and hatred and prejudice towards their own people, obviously, right? And we start to see a government that represents more and more all the people. So now the movement's going to have some trouble, because they've essentially obtained their two big goals, right? They have desegregation and they have voting. Again, with these laws, and then actually it playing out in real life, there's a separation. But now where? And we already saw the movement begin to break a little bit. And there's something called a March Against Fear, involving James Meredith. Remember, the student who went to University of Mississippi, that's going to really show how things are going to separate. So this March Against Fear, James Meredith decides he's going to walk across from Memphis to Jackson to register to vote. Again, a symbolic march, and he is shot and wounded along the way. So SNCC and CORE and the SCLC, all these people come in, and they take his place. They say, we are finishing the walk for him. And as they are walking along the road, cars are swerving at them, people are throwing bottles at them and breaking them, rocks, etc. And all these people are walking, and as you can understand, if people were throwing things at you and I, people start to get fed up. And one side of the group, SNCC, now led by a guy whose name is Stokely Carmichael, who I'm not a huge fan of, I'll tell you why in a second, he starts to chant, Black Power, Black Power, Black Power. And Martin Luther King and the SCLC start to chant, freedom now, freedom now, freedom now. And this is going to be one of those definitive moments where you see the movement separate, and where you see one side more radical and the other side still sticking to this civil disobedience. And obviously it's going to be tough for the movement to get along in the future when they have such different views of it, right? So Stokely Carmichael as well down the road is going to be asked, what is the role of women in this? Because at first there were a lot of women involved in SNCC and the SCLC and everything else, especially in SNCC, not the SCLC as much. They have a lot of women, but this doesn't become an issue. And then you have also a lot of white people who are involved in SNCC. And when Stokely Carmichael took over, he wanted to get rid of a lot of women, he wanted to get rid of a lot of white people. It becomes this more Black Power message. So at this one press conference, Stokely Carmichael is going to be asked, well, what is the position of women in SNCC? Like, what should they be doing? What is their position? And Stokely Carmichael responds, prone, which means on your back. So we could see where this is going, and that's just going to be a brutally misogynistic, terrible thing to say, and we kind of see where he stands about people besides black males being in charge of this movement. So we're going to talk about de jure versus de facto segregation in class. I want to save that. And I want to go down to urban unrest. A lot of these neighborhoods, like we heard when Marvin Gaye was singing that song, Inner City Blues Make Me Wanna Holler, these neighborhoods have such tough issues. They have kids are growing up in such abject poverty. They're going to have like all kinds of issues with education and everything else. And I'm sorry, think about downtown Buffalo. Think about people's realities and lives here. This is not something we could just say happened in the 60s. This is something still happening, right? So there's awful, awful race riots in some of these most impoverished communities and inner city areas. And one's going to be in Detroit in 1967. And you're going to see 43 people dead in 7 days with this big race riot. Another is going to be in Watts in 1965. Watts is a notoriously very poor black neighborhood in LA, and 34 people are going to be dead in 6 days. Tons of arrests, injuries, looting, everything else. So LBJ gets together something called the Kerner Commission to say, hey, why is this happening? And you and I can answer this. The Kerner Commission says, well, the reason why there's urban riots is because of poverty and discrimination. Of course that's why, right? So Martin Luther King in 1966 goes to Chicago, and he's trying to prove a point that racism is alive and well in the North, which it is. It just looks different, right? It's not that brutal kind of white supremacist KKK out in the open racism. It's still there. It's just a wolf in sheep's clothing. But he has a hard time getting this across. And the police who usually arrest Martin Luther King in the South escort him in Chicago. So right off the bat, it's very different. People aren't antagonizing him, and people are saying, why are you here? Why are you bothering us? This is a Southern problem. Why'd you bring this into our backyard? And again, how do we get people to realize de facto segregation? When oftentimes it doesn't have a face, it doesn't have a name, it's this insidious thing, right? And that obviously from Chicago is proved to be very difficult. That's his experience there. So cracks in the movement get bigger as Stokely Carmichael becomes more and more about black power. And the black power movement's really going to take root in the 1966. More radical change, cutting out volunteers, demanding black power, black independence with no white help. This becomes really big. And it's at the same time in 1966 that we have the Black Panthers. So the Black Panthers are going to start in Oakland. And Oakland is another city. Today, Oakland's thriving, really hipster, awesome history, awesome food trucks, by the way. If you ever go to Oakland, they have this really cool like food truck party in the street. But you have Oakland back then as a very poor, very violent, very rough place to be. And you have so many African Americans who have no choice and who live there. So we know Oakland is right across the bay from San Francisco, right? So these groups of young men are going to say, hey, the police are protecting us. They're, coming after us all the time. We have to protect ourselves. So the Black Panthers start this really, wear the black berets, and they start carrying their own guns and weapons, have a lot of violence, have a lot of shootouts with the police. And if you've seen, Forrest Gump, you'll recognize the Black Panthers from that movie. They're rejecting the nonviolence, right? And black Muslims have been around really since the 1930s, and they are going to gain a lot more power, and again, preaching this more radical message, refusing white help, refusing government assistance, self-discipline, self-reliance, and it's going to be Malcolm X, this fiery young speaker. He is eloquent, he is from the streets himself, and he's going to speak to these kids and speak to people, and they're going to say, yeah, that's me, he gets it, He becomes so powerful, and especially African Americans in the North's urban slums really respond to him in a big way, and this black pride becomes really, really big. And he's going to reject Martin Luther King's use of nonviolent protest until this dangerous extremist is going to go to the Holy Land. And he goes and has, this experience in the Holy Land as a black Muslim, and he comes back and he is all kumbaya, we should get along, nonviolent protest. His own people see him as a traitor to his cause and assassinate him in 1965. So this is, a time with so much death, so many assassinations, and we are going to talk about Martin Luther King's assassination together as a class, so I'm going to wait to talk about that. So when the movement continues and we have this change in its goals, after Martin Luther King's death, as you can imagine, the SCLC declines. People don't know where to go with this. There's a man whose name is Abernathy who carries on his, quote, poor people's campaign, saying that, so many of these issues affect people who are impoverished. But as you can imagine, Americans in the 1960s in the Cold War hear poor people's campaign and think of a lot of poor people coming together and think, communism, exactly. So black power loses power. The FBI is going to be brutal, voracious in seeking out members of SNCC, of the Black Panthers, etc. J. Edgar Hoover is going to be in charge, and oh my God, he is going to be extremely paranoid. He's going to wiretap all of Martin Luther King's phones because he thinks King is a communist at the time. There's awful stories of people who are going to be in apartment buildings in Chicago where there are infants sleeping and the FBI comes in and machine guns them. And again, there's this violence going on in the streets, but then why does the FBI have to be so violent? It's really, really awful. Spies turning people against each other. This is all part of kind of the unraveling of this movement. The Civil Rights Act of 1968, you don't hear about it as much. LBJ's kind of final thrust and attempt to help with how segregated neighborhoods are. And as you and I are going to look at a map, how segregated they still are, how do you get at this? How do you tell people where to live? How do you tell people to break up neighborhoods and mix more, and realtors to show houses to people who don't really live in the neighborhood? How do you, again, get at this de facto segregation and fix it? How do you change the way people think? And this is ultimately a noble law. But if we look at Buffalo, if we look at other cities, this is not going to be that successful, because how do you enforce this, right? One way people try to enforce breaking up of neighborhoods and making schools more desegregated and everything else and take on de facto segregation is with forced busing. So this is going to happen, and people basically choose where they want to live. And sometimes we said people choose based on their friends. And sometimes if you're white, your friends are white. And if you're black, your friends are black. When it's bigger and it's more sinister than that, it needs to be broken up. But how? How do you do that? Obviously, if people are living in areas where everyone around them is white and another area where everyone around them is black, then your school is all white and your school is all black, right? So because of the color of their skin not really being the reason, like in the South with integration, but because of your district, you have really segregated schools. So in areas like Boston, in areas like Denver and other areas, people say, I know, we will bus students into other school districts. So both white families and black families are going to flip out over this. And they're going to say, wait a second, my kid is happily going to their school with their friends, and now you're going to take 50% of their school and split up their friends and bus them hours away to another school and do the same with the other one? So this solution does not go over well. In Boston, especially in the 1970s, there's violent protests for 2 years. People block the streets. In Denver, people start buses on fire, and kids are sitting on the bus for hours again to get to school. So this only speeds up white flight, which we talked about. People say, well, if this is going to happen, then I'm going as far away as I can from pretty much anybody who's black, and they go further and further out in the suburbs, and that's just detrimental to our country understanding each other, to our economies and our cities, and everything else. However, one silver lining, lots more African American politicians in cities. If you look at cities like Detroit and Buffalo and LA and Atlanta and all this stuff, lots of people like Byron Brown, lots of people who are black in leadership and political positions who have a lot of power, which really wasn't happening before. And affirmative action is another way this is taken on. If you ever see the court case California versus Batt, this is a court case that involves affirmative action. Businesses and also colleges, with the prompting of the government, setting up policies to give preference to minorities for positions and places. And before you complain about this, all of you are going to benefit from affirmative action when you go to college because you are women, and women are considered a minority. So keep that in mind. Very controversial today, obviously. Many people argue it needs to happen. Many people argue it's unfair. Many people say, listen, we're not there yet. We're not colorblind yet. And the Supreme Court actually just made a statement about that a few years ago. And Sotomayor said, listen, like, I'd love to say we're there and that we all treat each other the same, but we're not there yet. So until we're there, we need policies like affirmative action. And today we know it's the policies of many businesses and colleges. Because of such anger with forced busing, because of such anger with affirmative action in the 1970s, those white Southern Democrats switch Republican. They were always kind of that solid South Democrat, and now they switch Republican. If we look at a lot of these southern states today, still, they are those red states, right? Because of that. And lots of Democrats leave, become Republican in the face of changes due to the civil rights movement. And today, you know, there's so much going on. We have Jesse Jackson and Push is really active here in Buffalo. We have Barack
Obama. And with the civil rights movement, we have to remember that we can change as soon as we decide to. Just because something has always been the way that it is doesn't mean that it has to stay that way. All right, ladies, I'll see you tomorrow. Bye.